welcome to this iCore webinar entitled Service Management, the Hidden Costs of Lagging Behind. So just before we get into the main topic, I just want to give a brief introduction to myself. So my name is Richard Johnson. I've been working as a consultant now for iCore for nearly 2.5 years. Although my experience in service management goes way back over 25 years. Over that time, I've had numerous positions, different industries. I've worked in automotives, credit services, lots of different roles across service operations, service introduction, and also quite recently in service improvement. Today's session is planned to be 45 minutes. As I say, the title, Service Management, Hidden Costs of Lagging Behind. So what do we actually mean by that? So, I'm sure, a lot of you have heard phrases such as, modern service management, agile service management, etc. Lots of buzzwords, lots of different phrases, but what does it actually mean? So what we want to try and do in this session is go through that a little bit, but also go through some of the wider impacts of not keeping up to date with modern practices, processes and tools. Just a very brief introduction. So sit back, listen and enjoy. I'm just going to give a very brief introduction to iCore as a company. So I won't dwell on this too much, but for those of you who don't know us, we've been operating now for over 26 years. Essentially, we're an independent IT transformation company. And we're here to help, work with companies to embed modern service management. So at the bottom there, you'll see a list of all of our sort of core services. So we can do anything from assessments of capabilities, so whether it's a full maturity assessment or individual disciplines. We help design, build and embed modern service management practices. In terms of governance, so we're here to help design and implement target operating models, as an example. And then finally, something we can do as well is around coaching and some operational activities as well. So we can provide consultants for coaching assignments, but also if there's a need for any sort of temporary resourcing, so whether it's for a particular discipline such as incident or change management, or for more senior roles, director type roles. So what we're going to cover today then? So a few things really. So first of all, we're going to go through the evolution of service management over the last sort of 30 years or so. With that, some of the key milestones around the advancement of the methodology, the tools, the processes, but also some of the milestones related to some of the wider external factors as well. So things like the introduction of agile and DevOps, all these types of things that have also had an implication on service management. We'll also go through some of the pitfalls of having outdated service management, both in terms of tools and practices. We'll also go through some real world case studies, so some major companies that have had significant challenges from not keeping up with modern practices. We'll also go through some of the wider implications, so some of the hidden financial costs that are there of not keeping up to date. Also, I want to take you through a case study, so quite a recent case study actually, where we successfully integrated ITIL with DevOps tools and processes. We can take you through the specifics of that, and also how we sort of approach that as well. And then finally, just some practical guidance on how to embrace modern service management practices, including the overall iCore approach for doing that. So as I mentioned, so with this slide there, we're just taking through the evolution of service management over the last sort of 30 years or so. So, if you go back, go back to the early 90s or even into the 80s, actually, you look at the launch of the ITIL framework, version 1, version 2. I can certainly remember version 2 and vaguely remember version 1 with all the different processes and disciplines. And if you look back, that initial launch, that framework was very process driven, very sort of standalone framework, with very little integration or alignment with other methodologies or ways of working. The processes were very linear, very sequential in nature, and it was very much focused around service support and service delivery. So things like incident management, change management, they were the sort of early disciplines, launched as part of that first initial launch. If you then start to move forward a few years, into the 90s, as IT environments started to get a lot more complex, we started to see a lot more service management tooling. So I can certainly remember tools such as Remedy, the action request system, as a good sort of early example. This was way before tools such as ServiceNow and some of the modern ways of working. And those initial tool sets were very much focused on logging and managing incidents, requests, and changes, and a few other sort of disciplines that fall underneath that. Some automation, some streamlining, but at this stage, very sort of limited. It was all very much around just logging and running with those processes. When we start to reach the 2000s, we then start to see more of a shift towards a service-oriented approach. So, we start to see IT services aligning a lot more with business needs and objectives. There's a lot more focus on the value of IT, what that delivers to an organisation. From an ITIL perspective, we also see the launch of the service lifecycle. So we start to see disciplines such as service design, service transition, etc., and all the processes that fall under that. We also, from a service operations perspective, start to see a much more proactive approach as well. So you start to see things like proactive monitoring, alerting, a lot more focus on that, how to monitor, critical systems and applications. There's also a shift towards a shift left approach, so looking at how you can resolve issues as early as possible in the service life cycle. So a lot more sort of proactive activity happening during that time. More recently, we start to see the introduction of digital cloud services. So we start to see methodologies such as agile, DevOps. So these are practices that are very much focused on doing things at pace, a lot more flexible in terms of the overall service delivery. So we start to get challenges of how do we align our processes with these new methodologies. We also start to see the emergence of cloud computing. So cloud services. How do we manage service in the cloud with a lot more focus on things like scalability, security, and also cost management. Finally, during this piece, we also start to see a lot more focus on self-service portals, chatbots. So empowering users to do a lot more things themselves. So can they actually resolve issues independently, which obviously reduces the overall burden on IT support teams. And then finally, within the last few years, we start to see a lot more focus on data security and AI. So, so in terms of data, a much more data-driven approach, becoming a lot more data driven using metrics, analytics to help monitor and improve service performance. Security starts to become key, so cybersecurity incidents and breaches, which has led to a lot more controls within service management. And then finally, the use of artificial intelligence, so AI, to help predict and prevent incidents. But not only that, but also to try and automate a lot of the sort of the manual, routine tasks that we have in place. So that's just a high-level overview of the evolution. So on this next slide, just go through some of the typical pitfalls of having outdated service management. I've listed sort of 8 key ones there, but there's probably quite a few more really. But if I just go through some of these, so operational inefficiencies. So a lot of outdated service management processes, very very manual, bureaucratic in nature sometimes, which causes a much sort of slower delivery. Heavy reliance on legacy systems. All of this, causes slow delivery, longer response times, and ultimately, increased operational costs. Mentioned a little bit about security. So a lot of outdated systems don't adequately address, cybersecurity. You find a lot of poor management of risks and vulnerabilities, all of which, can potentially lead to potential security breaches and data leaks. Poor user experience, so users are a lot more reliant on systems now, and much more, wanting to have, quicker services, seamless access to IT services, but also, a lot more unacceptable downtime, even when it's planned. So all of this, can cause a lot of frustration among your sort of end users. Limited scalability, so a lot of outdated solutions may not accommodate increased demands or changes in technology. As organisations grow, obviously, their IT needs change as part of that. So you need a lot more flexibility and scalability as part of that. Limited automation. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's a heavy reliance on, can be on manual tasks, which in itself gives you the increased, chance of errors, human errors from doing that. Lots of overly complex processes in some of the sort of outdated systems. There's also the argument of having reactive versus proactive approaches. So I think, teams that are very much focused on, reactive operations, perhaps not investing as much as they should do in some of the proactive things. We've mentioned monitoring, event management, but also, data analytics and AI. Lack of integration. So, you do find, in some cases, teams working in silos, having very different processes, different tools. I think the digital, DevOps example is a good one. These teams are used to working at speed. They have their own tool sets that may not align initially with, some of the service management tool sets. But also as well, I mean, those teams are, used to working at pace. They're going to be working on software, developing software, sending out releases very frequently. A lot of this is in conflict with traditional service management processes. And then finally, lack of visibility. So some of the outdated tools may not provide the visibility or transparency, to monitor service performance. I think before I just move on to the next piece, I just want to give you a good example actually of a recent assignment where, we've, successfully looked at both automation and integration. So, we worked on a project where we basically designed and built a new software request process for end users. So the process enabled, user to raise a request within ServiceNow. We integrated ServiceNow with their procurement tool and also with their asset management tool. So basically, what it enabled it to do was that you raise a request, the request would get approved very quickly. It would do a license check. It would then automatically deliver the software to the user's desktop. So just a good example, really, of how you can integrate, service management tools with all other tool sets to give a seamless level of service to an end user. Okay, so I just want to go through some of the more sort of wider financial implications. And this really sort of leads on from the last slide, really. So on the previous slide, we mentioned operational inefficiencies. So having outdated systems, can cause, poor service delivery, longer downtime for critical systems. And all of this can lead to potential financial losses. Also, in terms of productivity, so if you're finding teams are spending more time on reactive support, instant resolution, this can reduce overall productivity and have a direct impact on revenues and profitability. So, and with that as well, it's also taking employees away from doing some of the more sort of proactive activity or innovation activities. Maintenance costs, so having legacy systems typically gives you high maintenance costs. So it could be organisations having to spend a lot more time on things like patching, bug fixes, and keeping systems operational. Missed business opportunities, so having outdated systems can hinder ability to quickly adapt to market changes and really seizing new business opportunities. And again, this can result in both missed revenue and growth potential. Mentioned a lot about security, but obviously, if there is a security breach, data loss can result in significant financial penalties and loss of a company's reputation as well. Reduce competitivity. So, a loss of competitive edge. So if you've got, customer-facing systems, services, they're affected by unplanned downtime, slow instant resolution, this will cause customer dissatisfaction and potential customer loss, which obviously is a no-no. And then I guess the final one, which is probably the one that's probably most sort of overlooked, is high turnover. So if you've got employees that are constantly firefighting, working on reactive support, it's going to cause frustration and ultimately, can cause employees to leave. So, and we all know the costs of recruiting and training new employees. Okay, so now I just want to take you through some real world case studies. So I've highlighted three main ones here. The first one actually is one that I remember very well, actually, because I was actually working in the industry at the time, in the credit service industry. So go back to 2017, there was a major credit reporting agency which experienced a massive data breach, and that ultimately exposed personal information of nearly 147 million individuals. So massive case study, massive outage. The breach was caused by an unpatched vulnerability in their software. And because of their outdated practices, it meant they had no process for for regularly patching known vulnerabilities. The impact of this was significant, so certainly the financial repercussions, including regulatory fines, legal settlements, and also, substantial drop in its stock price. So if you take that example, so how could the company have, potentially prevented that incident or certainly mitigated against it? So I've highlighted 4 there that could have helped, in this particular instance. So, I'm going to mention lots around monitoring, but proactive monitoring, monitoring of critical systems and applications. This can help detect anomalies and potential issues before they escalate into major disruptions. Vulnerability assessments and patch management. I think both of these sort of go hand in hand a little bit, but certainly having regular vulnerability assessments. This particular breach was caused by a known vulnerability in the Apache software, for which there was actually a patch available. So if they had regular patching, then that may have been prevented. But also as well, really sort of embedding this into your service design and service transition processes. So I know a lot of companies that have service transition criteria, that says that you'll only go live with, if there's no critical or high vulnerabilities, which is fine. But then also, how do you actually build that into your service design processes so that you've got the confidence that vulnerability assessments will be ongoing, once you go live with a solution. Incident response planning, so having, processes and procedures for detecting and responding to major security incidents. Second example is one, again, another major company. So this one was a flight operator. They experienced a technical failure that disrupted the online check-in systems, mobile check-ins, and also the airport kiosks. The cause of it was reported as a technical glitch that lasted over 48 hours. So significant in terms of the downtime. Again, the impact was massive. So thousands of flights delayed, cancelled. All of this resulted in financial losses and compensation, and a massive, dip to the company's reputation. Again, some more sort of, potential, mitigation strategies. I've mentioned proactive monitoring, so I won't go over that again. Incident response. So I think for this particular incident, having automation around the incident response may not have prevented it, but it may have actually, brought that downtime, down to a much more manageable sense of, something more acceptable. So obviously 48 hours. If you could have automated the instant response, then it could have helped to isolate systems, reroute services, and also recover the process a lot more quickly. Data analytics, so having data analytics to provide insights into service performance, could have helped in this situation. Service continuity, which obviously is an obvious one, but really emphasising regular testing of DR plans, may have helped to recover a lot more quickly. So the final example is one around a major cloud service provider. So this one was an outage too, but actually impacted a number of online services and websites. So, so companies that relied on the cloud provider for their data storage and hosting. The cause of this particular incident was actually human error. So, an employee actually put in an erroneous command that was inputted during routine maintenance, and what that caused was servers and subsystems to be removed from operation, so ones that weren't intended. Again, the impact was massive, so it disrupted, quite a lot of websites, obviously some big ones there, Netflix, Airbnb, etc. So how could this one be prevented? So I think with this one, you probably want to look at the change management processes. Was the change management processes strict enough? Can it help prevent human errors? So having things like approval workflows, automating the checks as well to validate changes before they're executed. These things that could have helped mitigate this type of incident. Redundancy and failover. So not only just at the regional level, but also within services and subsystems, this could have minimised the impact of this outage. I've mentioned a lot around incident response, but also, if you look at automation a lot more widely, so having automation and orchestration tools that really streamline the incident resolution and change management processes. Right, okay, so I just want to take you through a recent case study. So this is one that I was involved in, where this really gives a good example of how you can actually integrate service management with other methodologies. So a bit of background to this one then. So the client we were working with, we've just recently gone through a major reorg, and as part of that, it was an overall repositioning of their target operating model. So as part of the operating model, they had the traditional ITSM teams working alongside DevOps teams. So the DevOps teams who were responsible for supporting a number of digital products. So what we did find was, these teams had their own sets of tools, processes, very sort of siloed approaches. And what this led to was a number of challenges. And with this slide, I just want to take you through really three key challenges that we saw. So the first one was around tooling. So, so the service management and the DevOps teams have very different tools for change and release management. So, so the service management teams are using ServiceNow, DevOps teams are using Azure DevOps. But it wasn't just the tooling either. It was also the way that they looked at things. So they had very different views of what a change and release was. So we started to get into very interesting conversations about how digital changes mapped onto traditional ITIL changes. So what would constitute a standard change, a normal change, a major release, etc., etc. So we started to get into those conversations, and obviously with the DevOps teams, they were very much wanting to do things as quickly as possible, automate things as quickly as possible as well. So what did we do then to solve this challenge or tackle this challenge? So the first thing we did was to integrate ServiceNow with Azure DevOps, and specifically we integrated the change management module within ServiceNow in Azure DevOps. So we did that as an integration piece. We then looked at the change and release processes, from a service management perspective, and how that mapped across the software delivery process that they were using, which was shown on this screen here, which was a continuous integration, continuous delivery approach, which is quite typical for DevOps teams. We did that mapping. So what we did was to look at each of these stages to see what was being delivered at each stage, what were the quality gates, the different checks, etc., etc. We also looked at testing as well. So we looked at the test strategy that was being adopted by the DevOps teams. So what were the specific tests that were being carried out at each stage, and really how that mapped across test management from an ITSM perspective. So by doing that integration of the tools and alignment of the processes, what that then enabled us to do was effectively gave us the confidence to go and automate standard changes for some of these types of releases. So basically, we'd have the DevOps teams operate as they would normally within Azure DevOps, but then at a certain point in their release lifecycle, a change request would automatically be created within ServiceNow. So if you think of this life cycle, once you get to the test phase, all of the key elements have been built, integrated, and tested. And as long as those tests were successful, a change request would then be automatically created. So that took out loads of manual activity, loads of sort of checks from a change management perspective, real sort of benefits from doing that. We also looked at the integration for incidents as well. So we integrated the incident management module from ServiceNow and Azure DevOps. So what that enabled us to do then was to effectively, if there was a ServiceNow incident which was deemed to be software related, it could automatically trigger a software bug into Azure DevOps. So we'd set that integration up. But then once we got that integration, it then enabled development and DevOps teams to contribute a lot more efficiently to incidents. So rather than having to go into ServiceNow, they could carry on doing things in Azure DevOps, and all of their updates would be basically copied into the ServiceNow parent ticket. So again, just another good example of how we integrated and align the different tool sets. The second challenge was really around people. And because one thing we did find was that the collaboration between the service management, the DevOps teams, particularly during major incidents, was poor, and just wasn't happening as efficiently as it should be. So how did we tackle this problem? So the first thing we did was to look at incident operating models. So for each of the key digital products, we defined who was providing second line, third line support, what the escalation points were, etc., etc. So a lot more clarity then around overall roles and responsibilities. And even though we still kept the approach of having a tiered support model, we also looked at incident swarming, specifically for major incidents. So we set up swarm teams that were aligned to each of their digital products. So within those swarm teams, we had specialists for each area. So we had things like to have roles such as site reliability engineers, application support, networks, developers. All of these made up a swarm team that were dedicated to a particular digital product. Also, as part of that, we set up dedicated channels for communication. So each swarm team had their own MS Teams channel, which then enabled them to collaborate. So all sounds very simple and straightforward, but it's amazing just by doing these activities, aligning on roles and responsibilities, can massively improve the way you do things, particularly around incident management. The third challenge was around processes. So one of the things we found was that a lot of the DevOps teams really lacked knowledge of key service management processes, and also were very sort of reluctant to use them in some cases because they saw them as very sort of bureaucratic in nature, very manual in nature. So one of the things we had to do was really sell ITSM to them, the benefits of following a service management approach. We then started to create simple learning paths. So we basically picked out 4 processes. So incident, problem, change and request. So they were the 4 processes where we thought, the teams didn't necessarily need to be experts, but they needed to, have a basic understanding, what the process is, what the key concepts are, but also, how they can actually, perform those operations in service now. So to create a whole learning path with bite-sized chunks of online training to help them develop their knowledge, certainly to a more sort of foundational level of ITSM. So with this then really, I think with this, with this case study, if you think of the, the specific, value outcomes of this, so certainly, we improved collaboration across all the key processes. We started to see teams working together, not against each other. We also greatly enhanced the handling of digital changes and releases by streamlining that overall end-to-end process. And then finally, I would say, certainly improved the overall customer experience, because certainly when it came to incidents, resolution times were a lot quicker, escalation was a lot more efficient and happening a lot more promptly. Right. Okay. So I guess, so we've covered a lot of theory, and some case studies. But I guess, how can we really sort of summarize what modern service management is, and what practical steps can be taken, to move to this approach? So in this summary slide, what I've tried to do here is I've highlighted what I see as 8 key components that make up a modern service management framework. So, we've already covered, a lot of this, so I won't go into the detail, but just a quick summary of some of these, so DevOps and agile integration, which we've talked about in length. Obviously it fosters collaboration across the teams, promoting faster service delivery. Self-service, so I think, having, user-friendly portals, chatbots, really, this is all about empowering users to do things themselves, do things independently. Having a data-driven approach, so, using data to help streamline operations, potentially identify areas of improvement, etc., etc. Proactive monitoring, I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but certainly having monitoring of critical systems and applications, I think, is key in help to detect things before they become a real issue. AI, machine learning, we haven't talked too much about this, but having predictive analytics, helping problem resolution, proactive management, these are all the things that AI, machine learning can help achieve. I guess having an overall service centric approach, so shifting away from just merely managing technology, but looking at how you actually align IT, with the goals, the goals of the organisation, and having that end-to-end service capability. Security, which I mentioned again at length, integral really, to modern ITSM, having robust cybersecurity measures, proactively, addressing vulnerabilities. I I think I mentioned earlier about security, having that really embedded into service design and service transition, so that you've got the confidence that it's in place before you go live with a new service. And then finally, automation, orchestration. So I've given a few examples of how we've certainly used automation to good effect. But looking at how you can automate manual, repetitive tasks, taking out some of the the potential human error as well. I think it's important. So what's the iCore approach for this then? So I guess I've just highlighted a few sort of key things, the key steps that we take as part of this modernisation approach. So typically if we get involved in this kind of assignment, the first step we take is to conduct a full assessment of an organisation's service management capabilities, and I'll come on to that in a bit more detail on the next slide. If applicable, we can also conduct a maturity assessment of agile and DevOps capabilities. So we've got quite a much broader toolkit that covers different competence domains. We actually look at over 300 individual aspects of those methodologies and assess each of those. Also, you can do things like value stream mapping, looking at emerging technologies, AI, automation opportunities, and all of this really then helps to identify what the opportunities are for service management modernisation. With all of this, we work with an organisation to define a roadmap, and that roadmap will give you a set of realistic actions, both short, medium, and long-term actions required to improve current capabilities. Right, so just to finish off then, really. So I mentioned on the previous slide the modern IT service management assessment. So this is a service that that we can provide. Bit more detail here around so we break this down into four main stages. The first stage being understanding where you are. So so we have an assessment that looks at the basis of it really is the ITIL4 framework. So we look at organisations and people, information and technology, partners and suppliers, and value streams. We also look at how well integrated and aligned an organisation's processes are with other methodologies. So obviously we've talked about DevOps and agile, but also all the other key components on the previous slide. We would look at all of that, do an assessment of it. From this, we'll then start to think about, what the improvement opportunities, build, and start to build out that roadmap. And within that roadmap, we can also, identify, what are the quick wins and what are the longer term actions. Okay, so anyway, so this concludes our webinar today. I've included here all of the iCore contact details. So so if you do wish to discuss further any of the services that we provide, or if you have any questions on today's session, then please feel free to contact us. So yeah, it just leaves me to say thank you all for joining. I hope you found today's session informative and enjoyable, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.